So this webinar is to support the funding opportunity for the Strategic Priorities Fund Clean Air networks to build interdisciplinary communities to address air quality challenges at the indoor-outdoor interface. The aim of this webinar is to provide an overview of the network's call, including a summary of the objectives, the scope, eligibility and process for applying to the call. And we're going to start with some introductions to who's in the room with us today. So there's myself, you'll hear speaking, Bethany Adams. I'm a Senior Programme Manager with the Natural Environment Research Council.
Shauna O'Rourke, I'm Senior Programme Manager with the Natural Environment Research Council.
Dominika Radulescu, I'm Programme.
So Graham Campbell, I'm a Programme Manager in the Medical Research Council.
Helen Randall-Sly, I'm Senior Programme Manager for the Science and Technologies Facilities Council.
I'm Helen Rogers. I am a Senior Portfolio Manager at the Economic and Social Research Council. And I'm Lynette Preston, Portfolio Manager for the Economic and Social Research Council.
And I'm Caroline Culshaw. I'm the Head of Health and Environment at the Natural Environment Research Council.
Okay. So, firstly, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions throughout this webinar, and some of you will now be familiar with Zoom, thanks to our technical glitches. But there's a Q&A button on the top of your screens, which, if you have any questions, we'd be grateful if you could submit them through there. It'd be helpful if you could put through your full name when entering your questions. Additionally, if you're joining us on the phone today, could you submit your questions to atmospheric@nerc.ukri.org? And we'll try and answer those questions as we go through. I understand there's a bit of an echo in my voice, so just bear with us 2 minutes. Okay, so we think we fixed the echo, and hopefully you can all hear us quite clearly. So just back onto questions. For any questions we're not able to answer today, we will respond to you via email. So it's really helpful if when you give us your questions, you provide your full name. We are only able to see your screen names, which for a lot of you is only your first name. Also, just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and we will share it in due course via the NERC web pages. And also, if you are using the chat function, it is visible to all participants. So just be aware of what you send through that if your question's of a sensitive nature. We did receive a question around sharing the list of participants post-webinar, but obviously in light of GDPR, this is something we'd need to seek permission from. So we will look into doing that after the webinar. So with that, let's begin. So during today's webinar, we're going to introduce the SPF Clean Air Programme, talk a little bit about the Wave 2 activities, and then go on to talking about the network call. So with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Caroline, who's going to do the first section.
Okay, I'll just say when to move the slides on, because I think there are people on the phone, aren't there? Okay, so hello everyone, hope you can hear me and the echo isn't too bad. I'm going to give a quick introduction to the Clean Air Programme and the Wave 2 activities that we're planning to fund, and then we'll stop for questions about the overall name of the programme before we move on to talk about the detail of the networks call. So if we move on to the next slide. It's a bit slow sometimes on the machine. Just wait till it comes up. Okay, so I'll start off with the Strategic Priorities Fund. So the money for this call has come from the Strategic Priorities Fund, and this is funding provided by the Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, so BEIS, as part of delivery of the industrial strategy. So it has three main aims. The first is about driving an increase in high quality, multi and interdisciplinary research and innovation. The second aim is about alignment of UKRI investment with government research priorities and opportunities. And the third aim is about ensuring that the system, the research funding system is able to respond to strategic priorities and opportunities. So this fund is led by UKRI. If you don't know what UKRI is by now, I'll let you know. So UKRI is the UK's main agency for research and innovation. That logo is quite distracting. Sorry about that. So UKRI was formed in April 2018, last year, and it brings together the 7 research councils with the UK's innovation agency and the agency that's responsible for core funding of higher education in England. Together we have a combined budget of over £7 billion a year, and together we provide a strong voice for research and innovation in the UK. UKRI leads the SPF as a fund, and it's delivered by partnerships of the 9 councils and the public sector research establishments that are supported under BEIS, which in our case are the Met Office and the National Physical Laboratory. So next slide, move on to the overview of the SPF on clean air. So why for an SPF programme in this area was that despite improvements in air quality, research suggests that air pollution is still responsible for large numbers of early deaths and huge costs to the UK economy. We recognise that air quality sources and emissions and health risks are constantly evolving, and that most of the easy things that we can do to reduce emissions as a UK society have already been done. So we need to come up with some new solutions and look to the future to be able to tackle the emerging issues before they become entrenched. This aligns with the government priorities across a number of different departments. You can see there the logos at the bottom, and the Development Administration. So they're working with the funders to steer the programme, and it requires input from across the different disciplines supported by UKRI and the BEIS SREs, which is why it's being supported through the Strategic Priorities Fund. Move on to the next slide about the different waves. So we talk about waves a lot in UKRI. So just bear with me that I'll be using that terminology throughout the webinar. So the first wave of funding kicked off last year, and it was largely focusing on solutions for today's problems. So you can see the range of different research councils and government departments and PSREs that were involved in the first wave. And then the second wave is what we're starting now, and it's a more forward-looking programme, and reflected in that it has a wider range of delivery partners. NERC and the Met Office are the co-lead for the SPF for Clean Air for the UKRI and BEIS partners respectively. But we've had a few questions about, is this a NERC programme, is this a UKRI programme? I want to get across that NERC is leading this on, NERC and the Met Office are leading this on behalf of UKRI, and it really truly does span the whole remit of UKRI. So the next slide, we'll move on to talking about some things that we've got in place already. So we have some champions in place for the programme. Their role is about bringing the community together, making the links across the programme, links with other things that are going on, helping to drive impact. So this is the photos of who they are. It's Stephen Holgate, Martin Williams and Jenny Baverstock. So many of you will already know Stephen, Martin and Jenny, and they bring expertise from health, atmospheric sciences, policy and interdisciplinary working. And if you haven't met them already, I'm sure you'll be hearing from them sometime in the near future. The next slide is about the first wave. This webinar is really about the second wave. I just want to give you some context. So the aims of the Wave 1 programme were really about leveraging existing investments and taking that step towards multidisciplinary approaches, and working closely with DEFRA to inform the implementation of the Clean Air strategy. If you skip on to the next slide, you can see what we've funded. So in addition to the champions, we've funded these activities. This is quite high level, and then when you've got the actual slides, you'll be able to follow the various website links where there's more information about what we've actually funded. So we funded 5 projects that bring together UKRI's existing major strategic air quality investments, different combinations of our existing centres. The Met Office are supporting some new projects on emissions inventories, so watch this space for announcements because those calls have closed now. Met Office is also supporting some prototypes for a clean air analysis framework that will make the links between different types of models. And Innovate UK have supported or are supporting some business-led innovations to reduce emissions from non-exhaust and non-road vehicles. So if we move on to the next slide, so that's wave 1. We're moving into wave 2. So wave 2 is about looking further forward in time, on out to maybe a 2030 timescale. It's about recognising that air quality concerns on that timescale are likely to be on getting particulate matter concentrations down to World Health Organization recommended levels. So tackling the very small particles and the precursor volatile organic compounds that have the create these secondary particles. Wave 2 also recognises that lots of these new types of emissions will probably come from within the home and workplaces, which is actually where people in high-income countries, at least, spend most of their time. So the reasoning is they probably won't be effective to manage public health impacts solely through controlling outdoor sources. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to affect the new health risks? How are we going to assess the new health risks? How are we going to account for massive variation between different households? How are we going to influence what the population does in their own homes so that we can reduce emissions and exposure? So we go on to the next slide. These are the aims of the second wave. So the aims are framed around this kind of forward-looking issue of changing emissions and increasing importance of interaction between indoor and outdoor air, variable exposures, and the recognition that outdoor regulation can't solve the problem. So the aims of this wave of the programme are about building a new community that can work in this space, so breaking down the traditional divides of the Research Council remits. They're about wanting to deliver new knowledge to both define the problem and to work out what society can actually do about it. The aims are to provide consistent advice to stakeholders so that they can take confident action, and also to work with businesses to develop new services and products that can protect health. So overall, the main thrust of the wave is still about protecting human health whilst supporting clean growth. Next slide is about delivery, so the timeline and the activities that we think that we're planning to deliver through this wave. So we're going to start off with the networks to build community for the longer term. That's what we're going to talk about now. So, and then we anticipate opening another call next year for some research and innovation consortia. So we'll be thinking about how we scope and decide what's going to be in that call after Christmas. We're planning some more business-led calls that Innovate UK will run that will start next year. And the Met Office and NPL are going to do some further work to include these new concepts in the Clean Air Framework and support metrology across the programme. And there'll also be some further activities led by our champions to maximise the impact. So that is the quick overview and context of the programme and what we're hoping to achieve at a high level. So we'll pause now and consider any questions that we've got on that. Thank you.
Okay, so we're just going to start this Q&A session. I'm aware of the sound issues we had, so just want to remind everybody that we have got NERC, MRC, EPSRC, ESRC and STFC present. So we are very happy to answer questions across the remit. And we'll start with a question we received in advance, which Caroline did touch on, but I'll ask it to you again. So as this is NERC and UKRI, what's the role of NERC and what's the role of UKRI in this call?
Am I answering questions? Am I? Okay. So the role of NERC in this call is to with the Met Office is to co-lead the delivery of the programme and to run some of the calls on behalf of the other funders. But in terms of the role of UKRI, there's a UKRI central service that owns the fund, and in the context of UKRI as an organisation, as I said, this call really covers the full UKRI remit. So I think the other thing I would say is that we had some people that were interested in asking questions about arts and humanities. And I would say, because even though the arts and humanities aren't sat around this table, if there's a good reason for them to be involved, absolutely put it in the proposal and justify why they should be involved.
Okay, thank you. We've had a question around some of the networks particularly, which we'll come on to in the network Q&A. Although there is one question about, if you are awarded a network grant, are you able to apply for the following year research grants? I assume that means following awards within this programme. Yeah, so you can definitely go on to apply for research consortia, and equally you don't have to have a network award to apply into the consortia. They'll be completely separate competitions. Okay, and some of the other questions we're receiving are around networks, so we'll come on to that in the larger Q&A at the end. So with that, we shall move on to networks. And I'll pass back to Caroline.
Okay, so for people on the phone, we're on slide 15 now that talks about the network ambitions. So we're going to kick off the funding with some networks, and the idea is that the purpose of the networks is to address the programme aim of building a UK interdisciplinary community. So we're thinking for the longer term here. So the timetable, as you've just seen, the networks won't have delivered their outputs in time to inform the funding opportunities in this programme. So these networks are partially about positioning for future UKRI collective funds or other opportunities outside the UK that have a mission or a challenge focus that need things to be interdisciplinary. But it's not just about positioning for future funding. So we want the networks to be about drawing in the right disciplines, having those conversations that take time to understand each other's languages and research methods. It's about breaking down those disciplinary boundaries that have come up partially because of the way the councils have worked in the past, and not worrying about, as I said, whether you can include an artist, because AHRC isn't a formal delivery partner. In the councils, we often talk about finding the unusual suspects. So we don't want you to try and second guess what we're looking for in terms of disciplines based on, which funders are sat around the table. We're really very open to you including whoever you need to be able to make the change. We also want to see groupings of different stakeholders forming so that they can buy into and influence the thinking in this area. And then they become ready and receptive to take up and use research outputs at the end. So this is an opportunity perhaps to find those stakeholders who don't know they have a stake. We've allocated 3 million to this call and anticipate funding around 6 networks. So we were asked, why 6 networks? Why not just one network? So we think this is too big an area to do with one network. If we really want to encourage diversity of approaches and meaningful conversations with stakeholders, then there needs to be some focus. So we haven't specified the areas of focus in the call, but we could imagine perhaps that a group interested in looking at schools would need a different grouping to those people interested in care homes or interested in mental health impacts, or interested in particular types of exposures or sources. So we're not expecting the networks to work in isolation either, although we'll be supporting around 6. The networks will all be part of the bigger programme. So we have the champions as well who'll help to network the networks. And we're planning to try and take a portfolio approach so we can have distinct networks and minimise the amount of overlap where possible. If we go on to slide 16, the network ambitions. the network call scope. So this is what we think the networks will actually do. So we want the networks to work within the scope of Wave 2. So this is what I described about looking forward, identifying those emerging air quality issues, working at that indoor-outdoor interface. So I want you to work within that scope and pick your challenge and assemble an appropriate network, really. So we want you to find and engage the stakeholders, include them in developing research agenda, prime them to play their part in making change. We want you to find the right disciplines and researchers from different backgrounds and career stages. So not just academics, there's researchers in public sector organisations and in businesses. You think broadly about what researchers you need in your network. We want you to come up with some interdisciplinary approaches to tackling these issues. So as I said at the beginning, the SPF is all about interdisciplinarity and user-focused research. There are other funding routes for fundamental work or work that sits in the remit of one council. This is really about being able to work in an interdisciplinary way. We want the networks to take some risks, do some pilot studies, find out what works, do some experimentation in a safe space, because we think we need new ways of thinking in this area. And then finally, to be a focal point. So we want to use your networks to help disseminate our programme outputs and argue for further funding. So we want to work with you and use your networks as well. Okay, next slide is also about the network's call scope. So this is more about what you can spend your money on. So there are three things that you can spend money on in the network. So the first is core staff. So this is staff time to run the thing, to provide leadership, to make decisions, set direction, coordinate the network's activities. Would like to see some representation across the disciplines in this core team to give us the confidence that you know who are the right people to reach out to. It doesn't have to be a fully formed massive team with 50 co-Is. You know, you need to propose a functioning leadership team. You can spend your money on engagement and networking activities. So we try to articulate this as the things that you'll do to build the network. So who are you going to target? How will you get their views? So I expect there'll be lots of meetings proposed, but what are the tangible outputs of all those meetings and seminars going to be? Things like position papers, landscaping reports. So you know, we need some tangible outputs of this engagement and networking. But feel free to use other innovative methods of engagement. You know, we want to hear new ideas. And then the final area where you can spend money on. So we've called these networks, but I think across the councils, Network Plus might have been a more familiar term. So that's the term that some of the other councils use, because we want the networks to be able to deliver some small research activities as well between the members of the network. So you can include things in the proposal between the core members if you've got some strong ideas about what you want to do already. You can hold back some money for you to run small competitions as the network develops. So you can tell us in the proposal what those might be on, but if you don't know yet, because obviously the networks aren't formed, then you need to tell us how you're going to decide what they are and how you're going to fairly distribute the funds. So we've given some examples about the types of things that might be included, things like pilot studies, placements, discipline, hopping, opportunities for early career researchers. It's really up to you to specify what activities are going to be on. And we're also not prescriptive about balance across these areas. I think depending on the maturity of that part of the community or what the topic is, I think, you know, it would be fine. It's fine to have a different balance across those three areas. Okay, so hand back to Bethany now on the next slide.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to briefly talk you through eligibility and the application and assessment process. So the call is open to UKOI eligible research organisations and public sector research establishments which fit the criteria below. So UKOI grants may be held at approved UK higher education institutes, approved research council institutes and approved independent research organisations If you are a PSRE with 10 or more researchers with PhDs, then you may be eligible for this call as well, and you need to obtain designated independent research organisation status. So to do that, we ask that you contact Avril Orman, and the details are on the slide. Also, any Met Office or National Physics Laboratory collaborations should be recorded as project partners, and individuals from these organisations will use their own funds to participate in the networks. That's because the Met Office are our co-lead for this programme. And investigators may participate as a co-I or a PI in a maximum of 2 proposals submitted to this call. It's directly funded, and they may only be the PI for one of those. There's no limit on the number of co-Is you can have, and there's no limit on the number of networks an institution may submit. So just briefly on the application and assessment, the notification of intent deadline is 4 p.m. on the 5th of December, so that's next week. We ask that you submit via the online form on the NERC website, which you will see on the announcement opportunity page. If you go onto any of the other funders' sites, you'll also see a link to that page. There's a set of fields that need to be filled in, so it's title, PI, list of co-Is. Just to note, we had a question about this. We have asked for 10 co-Is on the notification of intent. That is not the number you necessarily need to have on your full proposal. There's no limit on your full proposal, but obviously it needs to be justified. And a brief summary of the vision of the proposed research, explaining how the work will deliver the programme's strategic aims and maximise the impact of the research. The NOI is not assessed, and it's used by us here in UKRI to help plan the assessment process. So the NOI is a requirement of this call, and full proposals will only be accepted from those teams who have submitted and completed an NOI form prior to the deadline. So on to the full proposals. The closing date is 21st of January. These are submitted through JES, and any proposal that is incomplete or does not meet UKRI's eligibility criteria will not be considered. We ask that you make sure you allow enough time to submit your proposals by that deadline. And then for assessment, all proposals which meet eligibility criteria will be peer reviewed, and this will be followed by a panel. Proposals will be assessed for excellence in research and innovation and fit to the requirements of the programme. Full details about the assessment process can be found in the announcement of opportunities, so I'm not going to go through them here. But just to note, we have got assessment criteria on this next slide. So this assessment criteria is all around what we'll be looking at with regards to your network bid. So it's worth reading very carefully through it, and that when you're drafting your proposals, you should really carefully consider the criteria, and you'll find this again in the announcement of opportunity. So I'm not going to go through it right now. And with that, we will move on to questions about the networks. Okay, so we'll start again with the questions that we received in advance, and for the ones that weren't answered within the content. So there's a question about expected outcomes from the call and how this call will align with later SPF calls. So the expected output of the call will be to generate a new coordinated self-sustaining UK community, positioned ready to drive forward and use world-leading interdisciplinary clean air research and innovation at the outdoor-indoor air quality interface. Longer-term ambitions to build networks and for people from different disciplines to explore how they'll work together for the future. The networks will be reactive to future funding opportunities, and also, as Caroline mentioned, about providing evidence about future funding requirements and needs in order to address these challenges. We then moved on to a question about network funding and activities, about the balance between engagement of networking activities and small research. So Caroline did cover this, but just to say again that this balance is to be decided by in your bid, and it just needs to be fully justified in your proposal. Okay, so we had nature of the network, and specifically if this is a call for a fully formed interdisciplinary multi-partner network where the partners are also proponents from early stages, or is it envisioned that the network can be formed by one entity and subsequently contacts with other stakeholders be made? So the spirit of the call is to create and build networks which will have a long future and be responsive to future challenges. It's not about fully formed interdisciplinary networks immediately, but there does need to be steps taken towards recognising the different disciplines needed for the network to address the challenge proposed. We expect additional stakeholders and members to be drawn in throughout the lifetime of the network and to set out how the network will identify those people. But just to note, we will not be adding new PIs or co-Is to awarded networks. So we also had a question about more information about what kinds of interdisciplinary groups and forms of expertise are supported in the creation of the networks. Can artists or cultural groups form part of the network? And if this clearly shows engagement with the public, the answer Caroline briefly alluded to is yes, the network may involve whoever is necessary to address that challenge. But obviously, if they are going to be receiving funding directly, they need to be eligible. So then we move on to question, do you expect each network to address a specific related theme or one of the themes or multiple themes? So it's anticipated that successful networks will define an interdisciplinary challenge aligned to the aims and objectives of the second wave of funding. The networks are to build interdisciplinary research and stakeholder community that can address the identified challenge within the programme themes. As such, the challenge may span one or all of the themes and just needs to be justified within the bid. So we also had a couple of quite specific questions about network content, which we thought would be quite good to highlight here. So where might analysing the cognitive behavioural responses of users or people have relevance, and where might a concern for indoor air quality regulation be relevant? So these are in scope, and it's for the network to propose and justify why this is an important part of the bid. And we had a question around what are the desired parameters for aerosol properties, size, distribution, composition, so on. And again, we set out in the motivation for this programme that the call relates to the smallest airborne particulate matter and the complex cocktail of volatile organic compounds. Specifics within that are for the network to propose and justify within the bid. So I'm going to let my colleague Caroline answer the next. We had, what are the future plans for these networks? And will there be related substantial funding opportunities?
Okay, so as I said, there will be future opportunities through the Clean Air programme, but those opportunities will be out before the networks have finished delivering their work. So I think, you know, the thinking and the early work that you do to set up your networks will probably set you in good stead for applying into the calls. The networks are not about influencing the scope of calls within the programme. Like I said, they're for a longer term. Do you go through all these?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's some questions about there was a question about funding available. So is the envisaged network supposed to undertake research directly or facilitates research proposals, projects from others by fundraising and becoming a catalyst of subsequent activities? So I said in the presentation, it's a bit of both. So there's some space in there for you to undertake your own small research projects between the network members, but then there's also the opportunity for you to hold back some of that funding to run some calls. And if you want to bring in additional co-funding from other funders, then that's great. We're certainly in favour of that.
Okay, so we had a couple of questions about eligibility, and I think we covered these about the number of co-Is and PIs, so I'm not going to go through it again. But just to add that there is no limit to co-Is or PIs on an individual proposal, which is the main question, but that the number that you have does need to be justified, and also not everyone who participates in the network needs to be listed as a directly allocated investigator. So we had a question around people who are non-eligible, so international collaborators, industrial partners, and so on and so forth. So those that do not meet the eligibility criteria may be involved with the network in 3 different ways: as a bid, as a project partner with their own money. They could participate in the network without being directly funded, so effectively cost neutral. Or there's an option for involvement via subcontract, but this would need to be clearly justified in the bid about why this is required. We also had a question about, are there any guidelines for working which could be replicated in other countries, and are there any rules around co-funding? So this is primarily focused on the UK, and perhaps it would be added value if it could be replicated in other countries. When it comes to co-funding, we have guidance around project partners and if you send us an email, we can send you the links for that. If this is industry funding, then the independence of the research and the risks to that perceived independence need to be considered and obviously justified in the bid. And we had, does any protocol need to be followed in more than one network bid, and subsequently if involved in more than one funded network? So just a reminder that you can only be named on 2, but if you do want to participate in more, then it's just about being confident that you have the time and resources to contribute effectively. So those are the questions we received in advance. We're now going to start taking some of the questions that we receive through this Q&A. Some of these will be quite short answers, some of them may be slightly longer. So the first question we have is, how many participants would you like to see in each network? And I'll pass it to.
Okay, so you, our colleagues, feel free to chip in, otherwise it's going to be the Caroline and Beth show. But yeah, how many participants would you like to see in each network? I don't think we're prescriptive. We're happy for you to propose how many you think are appropriate and justify that as well. I think a lot of it will come down to the topic that you choose. Broader topics will require more members. So we throw that one back open to you, for you to say how many you need.
Okay, moving on, we have a question about, one of our slides mentions exposures in the workplace. To what extent is there an expectation that the whole range of workplace exposure or pollutants would need to be considered, or would it be sufficient to be specific to pollutants such as PM or NOx within indoor workplace settings?
Do you have a view on that? That's more MRC's area than ours, occupational exposures.
I mean, I think going back to what was in the slide and what Caroline was saying, I think it's more about, you can justify why that particular pollutant is important, and from an MRC perspective, if you're thinking then of the health risks that are then associated with that air pollutant in particular. So as long as you can justify that, then I mean, I think that would be important.
Okay, so again, it's we're open for it to be a broad range of exposures or focused exposures, as long as it's justified why you're focusing on that exposure.
So there's a question about, how are you going to get the networks to work together? E.g., will you require all the networks to set out an amount of the grant aside to work together? Will you provide some coordination of the cross-network activities? And will you all the research activities to go across networks? Okay, so we talked about our Clean Air Champions, and part of their role within our programme is to bring together these networks and network the networks, for want of a better phrase. So they will help bring together those communities and those awards. I'll let my colleague see if anybody would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think in the call we haven't asked you to set aside any money for cross-network activities or broader programme activities, but to be aware that these things will go on and you'll be invited to attend them. So I think it would be prudent to bear that in mind when you're pulling your budgets together. In terms of cross-network activities, I think it really depends on what networks we eventually fund as to whether it's appropriate to have cross-network activities, but I wouldn't rule it out if if something came up. So we have, for those, if there's those of you on the line that are involved in the Wave 1 programme, we're planning a kick-off meeting early next year to bring together the investments that we've already funded through Wave 1, and we envisage having a similar event, perhaps on an annual or biannual basis, to bring people together. So our intention is very much that the networks will become part of the wider programme community, and there'll be opportunities for exchange. So the onus won't be on you to proactively reach out and network with other networks. We'll provide the space for you to do that.
Okay, so our next question, to do with eligibility. Can public bodies, for example, government agencies and third sector organisations, be included as co-Is and hence be costed, or should they be included as a project partner? Okay, so anybody who does not meet the eligibility criteria and this will depend on who your partner is, will not be able to receive directly allocated funding. So they will need to be included either as a project partner, or they'll need to participate in the network events without actually being detailed on the bid. So for example, as a stakeholder engagement and cost neutral, or if it's needed and you can clearly justify it, there is the potential for a subcontract relationship.
But specifically around the public sector, public bodies, government agencies, if you are a public sector research establishment with a credible research capability, you are eligible to be a co-I or a PI on these grants. That's what Beth was saying. If your organisation is not already an IRO, then you can get in touch with NERC and we'll give you some advice on whether or not you can be one.
Just to add, if you need to look at whether you can be an IRO status, I'm aware that the NOI deadline is next week, so the NOI is for our planning purposes. So if you could add in that you envision a co-I from the PSRE which is undergoing IRO status, just to add that in, and we will, and then in the full proposal we will assess eligibility there. We've touched on the next question, which was, can non-IRO participants receive budget, e.g. through subcontracts? Yes, if it's really clearly justified in the bid. How do you envision SMEs to participate?
So NERC is running this column. We don't have the capability to fund businesses directly. So I think SMEs can participate in network activities as project partners, bringing their own resources. And in the larger programme, Innovate UK will be running some calls, and there'll be opportunities for SMEs to apply for funding direct through other calls.
Okay. Can you give some more detail on how some of the assessment criteria will be assessed? For example, suitability of the network, core management team, and the range of expertise of the proposed core members, sustainability of the activity after the lifetime of the grant.
We are going to send the proposals out for peer review, and then there will be a panel considered to assess them. If you're asking for specific details of what we mean by the assessment criteria, things like suitability of the network core management team and the range of expertise of proposed core members is what I was saying before. Have you convened a core leadership team who's able to provide leadership and direction? Is there evidence of that? Have you brought together a credible group of people that will be able to reach out and find network members in the areas that you're looking for? The one around sustainability of the activity after the lifetime of the grant, some views around, we're looking for evidence that you've thought about how you might continue to maintain the group of people that you've brought together, be that what other funding opportunities you might be looking for, or other informal ways to keep the networks going.
Okay, we have a question about, can you very broadly define stakeholders? Does this include industry involvement, small to medium enterprises? So the short answer to that is yes. So it's whoever the network needs to engage with in order to really address the challenge posed. The issues when we're talking about eligibility is to do with who can receive directly allocated funding, but that doesn't, if you are not eligible to receive directly allocated funding, it doesn't preclude you from being involved in the network activities.
I think there was quite a comprehensive list in the call about what we meant by stakeholders as well, and we talk about policy, regulation, practice, health practitioners. So it includes basically anyone you can think of, really. So anyone who has a stake in this research area, and even including public engagement. if that's relevant to the topic that you specify.
So the next question about anticipating stakeholders being included as COI. So again, that's about eligibility. I think we've already answered that. So who is listed as a COI or PR on the bid needs to meet the eligibility criteria. Will there be any coordination between network activities? So we've touched on this about there being sort of an annual meeting where we try and bring things together, by our champions doing those sorts of roles. I think we've touched on that one. If we are interested in participating as an energy sector company, how do we best flag our interests and contact details to those pulling together the calls?
So I think attending this webinar is a good first start. We haven't got any formal processes in place to do any matchmaking of people that are interested in networks. So I would suggest, if you know researchers that you would want to work with, then make contact with them directly. If anyone on the webinar line has an interest in working with Steve and his energy sector company, then flag it with us, and we can share your contact details after the call.
Okay, and so if you are interested in that, just email atmospheric@NERC and we'll follow up with you. So can the networks distribute money via competitions, for example, to people not originally identified to support activities, workshops, travelling, hub and spoke funding?
Yes.
I think we've answered that. Okay, so we've had a question about what are our panel's thoughts on relevance of looking at something that's beyond the scope of this webinar. So the webinar is to support the call and to answer questions around the call. So our opinions on the relevance of looking at specific areas of air quality, I think there are other mechanisms for that.
Just to say that we've set out in the call motivation, if you look in the full call document, it does talk about a full range of indoor exposures, and we've set out that VOCs and fine PMs are likely to be a big issue. But if we're thinking about older housing stock and indoor exposures and interaction with bioaerosols and biological particles, I think that is within the scope of the call.
Okay, and we've got a question around, are exposures other than indoor air pollution in scope, e.g. through ingestion of house dust, direct contact with consumer products used indoors, or should the networks entirely focus on air pollutants? So we've set out in the call document, it's about looking at that ultrafine particulate matter and those sort of reactions with volatile organic chemicals. So if that is within that scope, then yes, it's in scope for this bid, and it's just about justifying that in the network and why there needs to be a network on that. So it's just about justifying it in your bid.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? We're not looking at indoor exposures in the indoor environment. We're interested in air quality exposures and how the indoor emissions affect the outdoor and how the outdoor air affects the indoor. So the thrust and the main focus, I think, is about atmospheric. It's about air pollution.
So our call documents focus specifically on vulnerable groups and health, but it's not mentioned in this webinar. You didn't miss a slide. I think we did touch on it. But will this call consider allowing other groups and criteria such as workplace and well-being?
So we're looking to constrain this program into around looking at those that are most vulnerable, just because it's a big problem, and even though it feels like 22 million is a lot of money, it won't actually go very far. So the priority is around health impacts, and we'd like to see a focus on various vulnerable groups.
Okay, on your assessment criteria, you have potential of the network to deliver original, high quality activities of national importance and international standing I'm not sure there's a question with that, so we'll move on. But the assessment criteria should be carefully considered when you're constructing your bid. In the view of the short time, is there a risk that networks will be built from researchers already working together? We, for example, are not familiar with many researchers working on many of the diverse aspects of the issue. How can we identify them even if we cannot or will not meet the deadline?
So I don't think it is a particularly short time. The call has been open for several months, and we've said that the network doesn't have to be fully formed at the time of application. But what we're looking for is a core group of people with a plan on how, over the lifetime of the network, they'll reach out and engage the relevant disciplines.
Okay. Also on our assessment criteria, you have potential of the network to deliver original, high quality of, oh sorry, no, I've just answered it. Sorry, apologies. How are the first 3 programme themes intended to feed into the fourth, the Clean Air Analysis Framework? So this is about how our larger programme themes feed together.
Yeah. So that's we're going to think about that when we do the scoping for the consortia call.
Can you identify COI's change between notification of intent and the final submission? Yes, the final submission, they can, what we would ask is that it is limited. If it's a change of one, for example, somebody is no longer on it, that's one thing. The PI may not change, and the COIs help us to plan for our assessment process. So we would ask that you try not to change them, but we do understand that obviously somebody may leave the organisation or you may have a change and so on and so forth. But we would ask that you try and avoid. We're coming to the last few questions. We're interested in joining a network. We work on mechanisms of the deleterious effects of environmental agents. So I think that's just a call for interest. If anybody on the line is interested in the same area, you can respond to Francisco.
So we're going to publish on the website, along with the video of this webinar, a list of FAQs. I think if people wanted to send us a paragraph of who they are and what they're interested in, and that they'd be interested in joining a network, we could potentially publish that as well, as long as you gave us permission to include your contact details. I think it's quite short notice with the NOIs being next week, but I think that's something that we could offer.
Okay, and we've got the last few final questions coming through the chat. Again, about do you anticipate stakeholders being included as COI? So we've talked about that. It's all about the eligibility as to whether they can be a COI or not. Is the programme expecting networks to have specialist themes, for example, transportation, or to be more general? And is membership of a network a prerequisite to future SPF Wave 2 clean air funding?
So at the moment, in my thinking, I'm expecting that the networks will focus around specific themes that you propose, and it could be something on transport, or it could be something more general. But I think you need to propose something that has a focus and that will enable you to bring together the relevant stakeholders and the relevant disciplines. I think there could be cross-cutting networks that perhaps look at different types of methodologies, or could look at uptake of certain technologies. There's no prescription of how broad or how narrow a theme should be, but I think you need to propose something that has a focus.
Okay, we've also had a question about network coordination between network activities. I think we've covered that. So if you refer to the previous answer, and we'll also obviously publish our FAQs. There's a question about IRA status. If you email Atmospheric, I think you've been sent the details, we will make sure that you get a contact for that. And I think that brings, oh no, sorry, we've had one more in. Will there be any attempt to join groups who offer similar network themes? So presumably this is to do with if we receive two networks, two separate bids, which are very similar.
Will there be any attempt to join groups? No, the model that we're using doesn't have an outline stage, so there's no place in the process for us to kind of manage or join things together, and we probably would not be looking to support two networks on very similar areas. So my suggestion would be that you get your feelers out now and find out who else is interested in applying and in a similar area to you, and think about whether you want to join up at this stage.
Okay, and with that brings. Oh, we have one person saying something. I believe we're bringing our Q&A to an end. Okay, sorry, we had half a question typed there, but it doesn't seem to have the other half.
No, so it was a follow-up on that of their question in asking, so we won't publish the expressions of interest. No, we're not publishing the expressions of interest. The expressions of interest are designed for us to assess the level of demand and start to plan the peer review. But if you obviously you're suggesting that, so you think that will be a useful thing to do, but we'll consider that for future calls.
Okay, and with that brings our Q&A session to an end, and also this webinar to an end. So we hope it's been useful. Thank you for bearing with us with the technical glitches at the beginning there. If you have any feedback or you have any other questions that you think of between now and when the call closes, feel free to email them over to atmospheric@nerc.ukri.org. And just a reminder, this is we represent for the funders, so we will answer questions outside of the natural environment remit, so please do send them through. And just a reminder that the notification of intent deadline is the 5th of December at 4 p.m. And we will not be accepting anything after that deadline, so please do allow enough time. And with that, we're going to close the meeting. Thank you all very much for attending. We hope you found it useful.